Welcome to week 7 of Stories. This week I've entitled it, He Knows You. You'll hear from a few speakers, President Monson, Scott L. Anderson, and Vaughn J. Featherston. Each of them sharing accounts, stories where individuals going through hard times have had experiences there where they've known that God hears their prayers, knows them. I guess it's dedicated to any of you who at this time might be feeling alone, might be feeling like there is no one there, like it is becoming hopeless. Well, may you hear these stories and take away something that may provide peace, hope for you. Enjoy.
May I share with you the account of how our Heavenly Father answered the prayers and pleadings of one woman and provided her the peace and assurance she so desperately taught and sought. Tiffany's difficulties began last year when she had guests at her home for Thanksgiving dinner, and then again for Christmas. Her husband had been in medical school and was now in the second year of his medical residency. Because of the long work hours required of him, he was not able to help her as much as they both would have liked. And so most of that which needed to be accomplished during this holiday season, in addition to the care of their 4 children, young children, fell to Tiffany. She was becoming overwhelmed. And then she learned that one who has and was dear to her had been diagnosed with cancer. The stress and worry began to take a heavy toll, and she slipped into a period of discouragement and depression. She sought medical help, and yet nothing changed. Her appetite disappeared. She began to lose weight, which her tiny frame could ill afford. She sought peace through the scriptures and prayed for deliverance from the gloom which was overtaking her. When neither peace nor help seemed to come, she began to feel abandoned by God. Her family and friends prayed for her and tried desperately to help. They delivered their favorite foods in an attempt to keep her physically healthy, but she could take only a few bites and then would be unable to finish. On one particularly trying day, a friend attempted in vain to entice her with food she had always loved. When nothing worked, the friend said, "There must be something that sounds good to you." Tiffany thought for a moment and said, "The only thing I can think of that sounds good is homemade bread." But there was none on hand. The following afternoon, Tiffany's doorbell rang. Her husband happened to be home and answered it. When he returned, he was carrying a loaf of homemade bread. Tiffany was astonished when he told her it had come from a woman named Sherry, whom they barely knew. She was a friend of Tiffany's sister, Nicole, who lived in Denver, Colorado. Sherry had been introduced to Tiffany and her husband briefly several months earlier, when Nicole and her family were staying with Tiffany for Thanksgiving. Sherry, who lived in Omaha, had come to Tiffany's home to visit with Nicole. Now, months later, with the delicious bread in hand, Tiffany called her sister, Nicole, to thank her for sending Sherry on an errand of mercy. Instead, she learned Nicole had not instigated the visit and had no knowledge of it. The rest of the story unfolded as Nicole checked with her friend Sherry to find out what had prompted her to deliver that loaf of bread. What she learned was an inspiration to her, to Tiffany, to Sherry, and it is an inspiration to me. On that particular morning of the bread delivery, Sherry had been prompted to make 2 loaves of bread instead of the one she'd planned to make. She said she felt impressed to take the second loaf with her in her car that day, although she didn't know why. After lunch at a friend's home, her 1-year-old daughter began to cry and needed to be taken home for a nap. Sherry hesitated when the unmistakable feeling came to her that she needed to deliver that extra loaf of bread to Nicole's sister, Tiffany, who lived 30 minutes away on the other side of town and whom she barely knew. She tried to rationalize away the thought, wanted to get her very tired daughter home and feeling sheepish about delivering a loaf of bread to people who were almost strangers. However, the impression to go to Tiffany's home was strong. So she heeded the prompting. When she arrived, Tiffany's husband answered the door. Sherry reminded him that she was Nicole's friend, whom we had met briefly at Thanksgiving, handed him the loaf of bread and left. And so it happened that the Lord sent a virtual stranger across town to deliver not just the desired homemade bread, but also a clear message of love to Tiffany. What happened to her cannot be explained in any other way. She had an urgent need to feel that she wasn't alone, that God was aware of her and had not abandoned her. That bread, the very thing she wanted, was delivered to her by someone she barely knew. Someone who had no knowledge of her need, but who listened to the prompting of the Spirit and followed that prompting. It became an obvious sign to Tiffany that her Heavenly Father was aware of her needs and loved her enough to send help. He had responded to her cries for relief. My dear sisters, your Heavenly Father loves you, each of you. That love never changes. It is not influenced by your parents, by your possessions, or by the amount of money you have in your bank account. It is not changed by your talents and abilities. It is simply there. It is there for you when you are sad or happy, discouraged or hopeful. God's love is there for you, whether or not you deserve love. It is simply always there.
And so, following the prompting during the next talk with the same group of youth there, I just stood up and said, I just feel prompted to tell you this. You know this experience. It's in the August 1998 Ensign front cover. You know this experience. Somehow, as we think about what President Monson said, but I was there when it was originally given, when he was speaking it in the tabernacle. He stood up that day and said, I had another talk prepared for today, but I decided to change my talk. When I saw that beautiful blonde girl come in, and he just points out this little beautiful blonde girl. And in the midst of this sacred little experience, all the poor cameramen are trying to find a blonde girl so they can take a picture and send it out over the airwaves. And suddenly, in the midst of that, he stood up and told a simple but very powerful story to me. You know it, but I will rehearse just the details. He said, years ago in a little place called Shreveport, Louisiana, there was a little girl, about your age, she said, dying of a terminal disease. Her parents had saved their money, and they came to her and said, what would you like as your last request in life? What would you like? And she said, I'd like to go to Salt Lake and get a blessing from a general authority. They were so impressed with her incredible desire, when she could have had anything, that this is what she wanted to do. They saved their money and planned their vacation for the next week. But she got so sick in the next week she couldn't travel, and the doctor warned them if they took her, she might not live. So the sweet little family just knelt down and said, Heavenly Father, they'd shown her the pictures of all the general authorities, and she had selected Thomas Monson's picture and said, I'd love to have a blessing from him. So they just knelt down, this faithful little family, and said, Heavenly Father, we have state conference coming in 2 weeks, and you have to send somebody. Could you just send Thomas Monson? Now, they didn't know that assignments are made over 6 months ahead. They didn't know that he was already assigned to be in El Paso, Texas, the weekend they were praying about. They didn't know that. They just knelt down and said, she's just one little girl, but she's our little girl. Could you just send Thomas Monson? He then, in this beautiful talk, stood up and said, so I arrived at the church office building, was beckoned into Ezra Taft Benson's office. He said, I know you're supposed to be in El Paso, Texas in 2 weeks, but I have someone else prepared for that conference. Could I send you to Shreveport, Louisiana instead? He said, certainly. And then he said in his talk, he hadn't received a phone call, but he had received a message. I have a question for you, bright, intelligent, wonderful youth. Is your faith simple enough to believe that when you walk into that church building on Sunday and the name on the front says Jesus Christ on the front of the building, that his love and concern is so personal, so individual, that he would willingly change the business stuff for his children? That he cares more about you than he cares about conferences and buildings and meetings and all of that? That you are the temple that matters the most of all the temples on the earth. That his personal concern is just that great. And I believe with all my soul that President Thomas S. Monson was standing sharing with us this story to help us understand this principle and deeply internalize it. So all of a sudden he was in Shreveport, not really knowing why he should go. He's sitting on the stand. The meeting's about to start. The stake president leaned over and said, "There's a little girl. She lives 60 miles away. She would like a blessing from you." He said, "How long would it take us to get out and back?" He said, "Oh, about 3 hours." He looked at his schedule and said, "I don't have 3 hours." He said, "Why don't we just send the stake presidency to give her the blessing, and we'll mention her name in conference, and would that be all right?" And they assured him that would be fine. So they called the sweet little family right before the conference started and said, "I'm sorry he can't come. He just doesn't have the time. But we'll be out tomorrow afternoon to give her the blessing." This sweet little family had been sitting in church the week before. They had heard the bishop stand up and say, "Our general authority visitor has been changed, and Thomas Monson's coming." They'd run home from church and grabbed their little girl and said, "You stay alive 6 days. Your last request is going to be fulfilled." How do they go down the hall now and say, "He's busy"? So somehow the sweet family sat and talked till about 7:45, at which time they suggested they might pray again. They knelt down and simply said, "Heavenly Father, she's just one little girl, but she's our little girl. Please." He said, "I was sitting on the stand at 7:45 and 3 times got this message. Go give that little girl a blessing." He reached over and grabbed a member of the stake presidency and said, "If we left at 3 in the morning, we could be out there by 4:30 and give her the blessing and be back by 6 for my interviews. Do you have anything at 3 in the morning, President?" He said, "No, it's a good time for me." He left and went and called the family that very moment. "For just a minute, would you just do this with me? Would you just think about being in the house when the phone call came? You've just stood up off your knees. You haven't walked down the hall to tell the little girl he's not coming. You've just standing there with your family after saying your prayers. And the phone rings. How would you like to be the person to answer the phone? And here, he'll be there tomorrow morning at 4:30 if that's not too early. How'd you like to hang up the phone and look at your family and say, that was the stake president. He's coming tomorrow morning. How'd you like to now go down and kneel again around your loved one's bed and kneel and be called on to pray in the family and try to choke out these words, Heavenly Father, we always knew you loved us. We just never knew how much. As he finished that beautiful talk, looking again at that beautiful little blonde girl sitting in the balcony of the tabernacle, he said these words, I bear witness that Jesus of Nazareth does love little children, and that he listens to your prayers and responds to them. As I finished giving that part of the talk, a sweet little blonde girl in the aisle was crying. She was sitting in the Especially for Youth group. Now, the beautiful little girl that received the blessing passed away sometime after that, and most of you know about that part of the story. But the little blonde girl from the balcony in the tabernacle when he gave his talk was sitting in that EFY session right back there. As she came up to the front, she said, why'd you tell my story? I said, I don't know. And she stood in front of all those wonderful youth and said, I know Heavenly Father loves us and cares about our needs. My mother had been excommunicated from the church when I was young. My grandmother called me and said, I'd like to take you to General Conference. We lived in California and drove up here and only were going to get into one session. I was in the motel that morning and knelt down quietly in the corner and said, Heavenly Father, I'm trying to make a decision about being baptized into your church. My mom's trying to discourage me, but told me I could choose for myself. If I knew you loved me, I would be glad to join your church. She walked into General Conference and sat down on the balcony. Second speaker stood up and said, this is for you. And finished his talk by saying, he listens to your prayers.
Church, a Relief Society president was at dinner, and all of a sudden she jumped up and she said, I've got to go. And her husband said, where are you going? And she said, I can't tell you, I'll be back later. And she was gone for about an hour, and when she came back, her husband said, what was that all about? And she said, I had the strongest impression. I had to go to the bishops. I went over and knocked on the door, and the bishop's wife came to the door, and I said, Lorraine, I'm here. How can I help? And the tears flowed down her cheeks, and she put her head down on my shoulder and wept and wept. She said, you know, everybody loves my husband. He's the bishop, and they bear testimony about him on Fast and Sunday, and they talk about what a great man he is. I'm not sure anybody in the ward even knows I'm here, knows I exist, or even cares. I wondered even if God cared or knew I was here. And so I knelt down and prayed, Heavenly Father, if you know I'm even here, if you even care, please let me know. And there was a knock on the door, and the Relief Society president said, I'm here. How can I help?